My name is Harper Sinclair, and I'm 32 years old. Right now, I'm standing in the middle of my father's $2 million party, surrounded by 300 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in California, and my hands won't stop shaking. The champagne glass I'm holding feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. My father, Richard Sinclair, is on stage under a spotlight that makes his silver hair gleam like a crown, and he's pointing directly at me with that same dismissive smile I've seen my entire life. His voice booms through the microphone, cutting through the jazz music and polite chatter like a knife. "Unlike my useless daughter over there," he says. And the entire ballroom goes silent, who's never contributed anything to this family. 300 pairs of eyes turn to stare at me. Some people smirk, others whisper behind their hands. My stepmother Vivian and my brother's fiancée Sienna are barely hiding their satisfied grins. But what my father doesn't know, what none of them know, is that in exactly 17 minutes, I'm going to walk up to that stage and destroy everything he's built on lies. Before we dive into how I got here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you're ready to see how this story unfolds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you're going to want to see the look on my father's face when I reveal the truth. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. I grew up in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home, where every room was perfectly decorated and every surface was cold to the touch. My father, Richard Sinclair, built his tech empire from the ground up, and by the time I was born, Sinclair Tech was already worth hundreds of millions. We had everything money could buy except the one thing I desperately wanted, my father's attention. From the moment I could understand words, I knew I was second best. My brother Garrett was 4 years older, and he was the sun around which our entire family orbited. When I was 6 years old, I started taking piano lessons because I thought maybe, just maybe, if I was talented enough, my father would notice me. I practiced for hours every day until my fingers ached, and when I had my first recital, I looked out into the audience with so much hope. My mother Patricia was there in the front row, smiling and wiping away tears. But the seat next to her, the one I'd saved for my father, was empty. He was at Garrett's soccer game instead. I played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata perfectly that night, but it didn't matter because no one who mattered was there to hear it. When I was 8 years old, I won first place in the county mathematics competition, beating out kids 3 grades above me. I remember running home with the gold trophy clutched against my chest, so excited I could barely breathe. I burst through the front door shouting for my father, and I found him in the living room with Garrett, watching a replay of one of my brother's football games. I held up my trophy, my whole body vibrating with pride and excitement. My father glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before turning back to the television. "That's nice, Harper," he said in that distracted tone I would come to know so well. "Now please be quiet, we're trying to watch this." I stood there in the doorway, 8 years old and holding my first real achievement, and I felt something inside me crack. My mother found me an hour later, still in my room, sitting on my bed with the trophy on my lap, crying so hard I couldn't catch my breath. She held me and told me my father was just busy, that he loved me, that he was proud of me even if he didn't show it. But even at 8, I knew she was lying to make me feel better. Garrett wasn't cruel to me, not exactly. He just existed in a completely different universe, one where everything came easily and everyone adored him. When he turned 16, our father bought him a BMW. When he graduated high school, he got a trip to Europe. When he decided he wanted to study business, our father pulled strings to get him into an elite program in Switzerland. Meanwhile, I could get straight A's, win every academic award my school offered, and the most I'd get was a nod and a reminder that grades aren't everything. When I was 14, I got bullied at school by a group of girls who decided I was too serious, too focused on studying, too boring. They made my life miserable for months, spreading rumors and excluding me from everything. I finally worked up the courage to tell Garrett about it, hoping my big brother would protect me. He was a senior, popular, someone people listened to. He could have helped. Instead, he barely looked up from his phone. "Just ignore them, Harper," he said with a shrug. "I've got my own stuff to deal with." That was when I truly understood that I was on my own in this family. By the time I was a teenager, my father had made his position crystal clear. Garrett will inherit the company, he told me over dinner one night when I was 15, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. That's how these things work. You'll marry someone from a good family, have children, and live a comfortable life. That's what daughters do. I remember staring at him across the table, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, thinking about all the hours I'd spent studying, all the competitions I'd won, all the ways I'd tried to prove I was just as capable as Garrett. None of it mattered. I was a daughter, and in Richard Sinclair's world, that meant I was ornamental at best. But instead of crushing me, something strange happened. That dinner lit a fire inside me that would burn for the next 17 years. I decided right then and there that I would prove him wrong, even if it took me the rest of my life. I would show him exactly what this useless daughter could do. I just had no idea how long the journey would be, or how much it would cost me. MIT accepted me with a full academic scholarship when I was 17, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. Cambridge, Massachusetts was 3,000 miles away from my father's suffocating expectations and my brother's effortless success. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that worried my roommates, taking the maximum course load and filling every spare moment with research projects and internships. I majored in software engineering with a minor in business analytics, and I made sure my GPA never dropped below 3.8. But the real education came from Professor Lawrence Kim, a brilliant man in his 50s who taught advanced corporate finance and blockchain technology. He saw something in me that my own father never had: potential. Professor Kim took me under his wing during my sophomore year, letting me assist with his research on cryptocurrency markets and corporate governance structures. He taught me how to read financial statements the way detectives read crime scenes, finding the story hidden in the numbers. More importantly, he taught me about corporate power structures, how shareholding worked, how voting rights functioned, how someone could accumulate influence slowly and quietly without anyone noticing until it was too late. One summer when I was 20, I went home for a week-long visit that I'd been dreading for months. The house felt even colder than I remembered, and my father barely acknowledged my presence beyond a brief nod when I arrived. On the third day, I was walking past his home office when I noticed Head left the door open, which was unusual. He was obsessively private about his work. I glanced inside and saw stacks of documents spread across his mahogany desk, and my curiosity got the better of me. I knew I shouldn't, but I stepped inside anyway, my heart pounding. The papers were financial reports from Sinclair Tech, detailed breakdowns of the company's shareholder structure. As I carefully flipped through the pages, trying not to disturb their order, I started to notice something fascinating. The ownership was much more fragmented than I'd expected. My father controlled about 42% directly, and Garrett had been given 15% over the years. But the remaining 43% was scattered among dozens of small investors, former employees who'd received stock options, early venture capitalists who'd sold down their positions, and several offshore holding companies whose ownership was obscure. I took photos of several pages with my phone, my hands shaking, knowing that if my father walked in right now, it'd have no explanation that would satisfy him. Back at MIT, I showed the photos to Professor Kim, swearing him to secrecy. He studied them for a long time, his expression growing more intrigued. "Do you see what this means?" he asked me finally. "If someone were patient enough, smart enough, and had enough capital, they could slowly acquire these scattered shares. It would take years, maybe a decade, but eventually they could accumulate a significant stake without triggering any disclosure requirements until it was too late." The idea took root in my mind, like a seed in fertile soil. What if that someone was me? I had one major advantage. I was invisible to my father. He would never suspect his useless daughter of building power right under his nose. But I needed money, serious money, and I had almost nothing to my name beyond my scholarship and the small amount I made from part-time coding jobs. Then, 3 months before my 21st birthday, my grandmother died. She was my mother's mother, the only person in my extended family who had ever treated me like I mattered. In her will, she left me $500,000, much to my father's irritation. Head expected that money to go to him. I could have done what most 20-year-olds would do with $500,000. Traveled, bought a car, lived comfortably. Instead, I invested every single penny. This was early 2012, and he'd been studying cryptocurrency and blockchain technology with Professor Kim. I put $200,000 into Bitcoin when it was still under $10 per coin. I invested another $200,000 in early-stage tech stocks, companies like Tesla and Nvidia, that my research told me were undervalued. The remaining $100,000 I kept liquid for opportunities. My father would have called it reckless if he'd known, but I'd done my homework. I watched those investments like a hawk, teaching myself technical analysis and market psychology, waking up at odd hours to check Asian markets, living on coffee and determination. Within 18 months, my portfolio had doubled. Within 3 years, I'd turned $500,000 into $2.1 million. And all the while, I was secretly reaching out to the small shareholders of Sinclair Tech, using shell companies and intermediaries so my name never appeared anywhere. I started buying their shares slowly, carefully, always offering slightly above market price so they'd be motivated to sell. Some transactions were for just a few thousand shares, barely noticeable, but drop by drop, I was filling an ocean. I graduated from MIT in May of 2015 with a GPA of 3.9, summa cum laude, with job offers from Google, Tesla, and 3 prestigious venture capital firms. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was a gnawing need for my father to acknowledge me, just once. I flew home to California for what I thought would be a celebration, wearing my cap and gown, carrying my diploma in its leather folder. When I walked through the front door of the family mansion, I found my father, Garrett, and Garrett's new girlfriend, Sienna, having drinks in the living room. I stood there in my graduation regalia, waiting for someone to say something. My father glanced up from his scotch. "Oh, that's today?" he said. "Congratulations, Harper. That's nice." Then he turned back to Garrett. "Now, as I was saying about the merger with Patterson Industries, we need to move quickly before the market shifts." That was it. 4 years of brutal academic work, graduating at the top of my class from one of the world's best universities, and I got "that's nice" before being dismissed. Sienna looked me up and down with barely concealed contempt, then smiled that fake smile I would come to know so well. "Mitt, how impressive," she said in a tone that made it clear she found it anything but. I'm sure all that studying was worth it. Though personally, I never understood women who prioritize careers over finding a good husband. She said it sweetly, but the barb landed exactly where she'd aimed it. But the real shock came 3 weeks later when my mother's replacement walked into my life. My mother, Patricia, had died of ovarian cancer when I was 19, and the grief had nearly destroyed me. She was the only person in that house who'd loved me unconditionally. For years after her death, my father had been alone, married to his company. Then he met Vivian Monroe at some charity gala, a woman who was 38 to his 55, with the kind of calculated beauty that came from expensive salons and personal trainers. She had dark hair that fell in perfect waves, a wardrobe that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. From the moment she entered our lives, I knew something was wrong. She was too interested in the family finances, too quick to insert herself into business conversations, too eager to position herself as the new matriarch. At family dinners, she would make comments that sounded like compliments but left me feeling small. "Harper, you're so intelligent," she'd say, then pause just long enough before adding, "But you know, men don't really like women who are smarter than them. You should try to be more approachable, more feminine. Otherwise, you'll end up alone." My father would say nothing, just continue eating while Garrett looked uncomfortable, and Sienna nodded in agreement. Sienna Caldwell, Garrett's fiancée, was cut from the same cloth as Vivian. She came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so many generations they'd forgotten what it was like to work for anything. She was undeniably beautiful, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and the kind of effortless grace that came from a lifetime of cotillions and country clubs. She and Garrett had met at some exclusive networking event, and she'd decided he was suitable husband material. Within 6 months, they were engaged, and suddenly our family dinners included discussions of wedding venues, guest lists, and Sienna's opinions on absolutely everything. She made it abundantly clear that she considered me beneath her. When she threw her bachelorette party, a lavish weekend in Napa Valley, she invited every woman in our social circle except me. When I mentioned it to Garrett, he just shrugged. "Sienna thought you'd be too busy with work stuff," he said, not even trying to make it sound convincing. "You know how she is. She likes to keep things intimate with people she relates to." The message was clear. I didn't relate to them, and I never would. I tried one last time to connect with my father on a professional level. I'd been working remotely for a tech startup while living at home temporarily, and one evening I worked up the courage to ask him if I could join Sinclair Tech. I'd practiced the speech for days, highlighting my technical skills, my business acumen, my understanding of the industry. When I finally sat him down and made my pitch, he listened with an expression of growing impatience. Before I could even finish, he held up his hand to stop me. "Harper, I don't think that's a good idea," he said flatly. "People would say you only got the position because you're my daughter. It would undermine your credibility and mine. Besides, Garrett is already being groomed to take over the company. We don't need two Sinclairs on the executive track. It would just create confusion and competition." I felt like I'd been slapped. "But I passed technical interviews at Google," I protested weakly. "I have the qualifications." He stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "The answer is no. Go find a position somewhere else where you can build your own reputation." That's my final word on the matter. I left his office with tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall where he might see. That night, alone in my room, I made a decision. I was done trying to earn his approval through conventional means. From now on, I would build my power in the shadows, and when I was ready, I would step into the light and take what he'd earned. 6 months after being rejected from my own family's company, I was living in a small apartment in San Francisco, working as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech firm. The pay was good, but more importantly, it gave me the cash flow I needed to continue my secret stock acquisition strategy. I'd managed to accumulate about 18% of Sinclair Tech by this point, all through carefully orchestrated purchases that left no trail back to me. Then Vivian made her first real move against me, and it was brutal. It started innocuously enough. I came home for Thanksgiving dinner, which was already a mistake, but some part of me still craved family connection despite everything. Vivian had taken over all the hosting duties that used to belong to my mother, and she ran the household with the precision of a corporate CEO. During dinner, she was all smiles and charm, playing the perfect stepmother, asking about my job, my apartment, whether I was dating anyone. I should have known better than to let my guard down. 2 days later, my father called me into his study. His face was stern, disappointed in a way that made my stomach drop even though I had no idea what I'd done wrong. "Harper, we need to talk about something serious," he said, and the way he said serious made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Vivian came to me with some concerns about you. She says she overheard you on the phone talking about trying to take over the company, about buying up shares secretly." My blood ran cold. I had been careful, so careful, but had I said something on the phone? I frantically reviewed every conversation I'd had during that visit, and then I realized what had happened. I'd been talking to my investment advisor about purchasing shares of a completely different tech company, discussing strategy and percentages. Vivian had been eavesdropping, and she'd deliberately twisted what she heard to make it sound like I was plotting against my own father. "That's not what happened," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was talking about a different investment, not Sinclair Tech," but I could see he didn't believe me. Vivian had planted the seed of doubt, and it was already taking root. "Regardless," he said coldly, "I think it's best if you maintain some distance from family business matters. I don't want there to be any appearance of impropriety." From that moment on, he watched me differently, with suspicion instead of just indifference. Vivian had turned me from invisible to threatening, which was almost worse. But she didn't stop there. 3 weeks later, I got a call from my father that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped my phone. He told me that $15,000 had gone missing from one of his personal accounts, and the bank's investigation suggested the transfer had been initiated from our home network during Thanksgiving weekend. The only people who'd had access were family members, and Vivian had helpfully pointed out that I'd been using the home computer to check my email. "I would never steal from you," I said, my voice breaking with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Please, you have to believe me." But before he could respond, I heard Vivian's voice in the background, sweet as poison, saying something about how addiction and financial problems often run in families, how my mother's side had some history of instability. It was a masterful performance, planting suggestions without making direct accusations. The next day, 2 police detectives showed up at my apartment. The humiliation of being questioned about theft in my own home, with my neighbors probably watching through their peepholes, was almost more than I could bear. I sat on my couch, crying and shaking, while they asked me questions about my finances, my relationship with my father, whether I'd been having money troubles. Thank God I had an alibi that was absolutely airtight. The transfer had been made at 8:43 on a Friday evening, and I'd been in a study group at the MIT library, a video call with 6 other people that was recorded and time-stamped. I showed the detectives the recording, and they could clearly see me on camera during the exact time the theft occurred. They apologized for the inconvenience and left, but the damage was done. Even though I was innocent, even though I'd proven I couldn't have done it, there was now this cloud of suspicion hanging over me. Garrett started looking at me strangely at family gatherings, like he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about his little sister. My father became even more distant, more cold. I later found out through a contact at the bank that the money had been transferred to an offshore account, then withdrawn in cash from a location he'd never been to, but the digital trail had been expertly obscured. Vivian had done this, I was certain of it. She'd framed me perfectly, using her knowledge of technology and her access to the house systems to make me look guilty. And even though I couldn't prove it, even though the police had cleared me, the accusation alone had accomplished her goal. Now whenever something went wrong in the family, I'd be the first person they suspected. I was no longer just useless, I was potentially dangerous, and that made it even easier for them to push me to the margins. I was at a tech conference in San Francisco 6 months after the theft accusation, still trying to rebuild my reputation and my peace of mind, when I met the man who would change everything. The conference was focused on artificial intelligence and blockchain applications, and I was attending a panel discussion on corporate governance in the digital age. During the Q&A session, one of the panelists gave an answer that referenced Sinclair Tech's recent expansion into cloud services, and I found myself bristling at the inaccuracies. Before I could stop myself, I raised my hand and politely corrected several points about the company's actual strategy. After the session ended, a tall man in his late 30s approached me with an amused smile. "You know a lot about Sinclair Tech," he said. "Let me guess, you work there?" I shook my head. "No, I just follow the industry closely." He extended his hand. "Maxwell Grant. I used to work there actually, as their head of legal counsel about 5 years ago. And you are?" I hesitated for just a moment before deciding honesty was the best policy. "Harper Sinclair," I said, watching his eyes widen slightly in recognition. "Richard's daughter." Maxwell suggested we grab coffee, and something about his straightforward manner made me trust him. We ended up talking for 3 hours in a small cafe near the conference center, and he told me things about my father's business practices that made my blood run cold. He explained how he'd been fired for refusing to help Richard push out a business partner who'd been instrumental in the company's early success. The partner, a man named Dr. Edmund Whitman, had co-developed the core technology that made Sinclair Tech successful. But my father had systematically erased him from the company's history and denied him his fair share of the profits. "Your father offered Dr. Whitman a settlement of $200,000 for technology that went on to generate billions," Maxwell said, his jaw tight with old anger. "When Dr. Whitman refused and tried to sue, your father buried him in legal fees and procedural delays until he had to settle for pennies on the dollar just to survive. I was the one who was supposed to make it all look legal and airtight, but I couldn't stomach it, so I resigned. and your father made sure it'd have trouble finding work in the industry for years afterward. As we talked more, Maxwell revealed something that made my heart race. Your father's empire is built on some very shaky legal ground, he said quietly, leaning across the table. And right now, Vivian is working behind the scenes to consolidate power. She's convinced your father to start restructuring his estate plan to leave everything to Garrett, cutting you out completely. She's also pushing to have the company's bylaws amended to make it nearly impossible for minority shareholders to have any real say in company decisions. If she succeeds, even if you owned 30% of the company, you'd have almost no actual power. This was the confirmation I needed that my strategy was right, but also that I needed to move faster. Maxwell looked at me carefully, as if weighing how much to say next. I still have contacts in the industry, he said. People who respect me despite what your father did. Some of them are small shareholders in Sinclair Tech who'd be happy to sell to the right buyer, especially if that buyer was interested in eventually holding your father accountable for his past actions. I could help you, if you wanted. I know corporate law inside and out, and I know how to structure these kinds of acquisitions to keep them completely legal and completely private. I studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but all I saw was sincerity and a desire for justice. Why would you help me? I asked. What's in it for you? He smiled, but it was a sad smile. Honestly, partly revenge against a man who ruined my career and destroyed a good man's life, but mostly because I think you deserve better than what your family has given you, and because I believe someone needs to hold Richard Sinclair accountable. If I can help you do that while staying on the right side of the law, that seems like a good use of my expertise. We shook hands across the table, forming an alliance that would prove invaluable in the months to come. Maxwell became my mentor, my strategist, and my friend. He taught me the intricacies of offshore trusts and shell corporations, all perfectly legal when used correctly. He introduced me to a network of investors and former Sinclair Tech employees who were willing to sell me their shares at fair market prices. Within a year of meeting Maxwell, it increased my stake from 18% to 27%, and we were hunting for the remaining shares I needed to hit my target of 31%, the magic number that would give me real power. By the time I turned 30, I'd been working on my secret acquisition for almost 8 years, and the strain of maintaining the double life was beginning to show. I was successful in my career, having moved up to a senior engineering position at my company. But I was lonely in ways that cut deep. I had colleagues but few real friends, no romantic relationships that lasted more than a few months, and a family that treated me like an embarrassing obligation. I decided to make one last attempt to connect with Garrett, my brother, the person who should have been my natural ally. Despite everything, we'd grown up together, shared a childhood, and I hoped that somewhere under the layers of our father's influence and Sienna's manipulation, there was still a brother who cared about his sister. I invited him to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown San Jose, neutral territory away from the family mansion and all its toxic dynamics. To my surprise, he agreed to come. We sat across from each other in a corner booth, and for the first time in years, I opened up to him completely. I told him about how Vivian had framed me for theft, about the constant belittling and exclusion, about how lonely it was to be part of a family that didn't want you. Garrett listened, really listened, and I saw flashes of the brother I remembered from childhood, before our father's favoritism had driven a wedge between us. I had no idea Vivian was that bad, he said, and he sounded genuinely troubled. Sienna never mentioned any of this. Of course she hadn't, I thought. But I kept that to myself. We talked for over 2 hours, and by the end of it, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe I didn't have to fight this battle completely alone. Garrett hugged me when we parted, told me he'd talked to our father about treating me better, and for a few days, I actually believed things might change. Then everything fell apart. A week after our coffee meeting, I got a call from Maxwell, and his voice was tight with urgency. Harper, we have a problem. Someone's been asking questions about the shell companies you've been using to purchase shares. They've hired a private investigator to track the paper trail. It's sophisticated work, which means they're serious about finding out who's behind the purchases. My hands went numb. How did they find out? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. I don't know for certain, Maxwell said, but the timing is suspicious. This investigation started 3 days ago, right around when you might have mentioned something to someone about your concerns with the family. I hadn't told Garrett about the shares, but I had mentioned doing research on corporate governance, studying the company structure, trying to understand how things worked. It wouldn't have taken much for someone clever to put the pieces together. It was Garrett, I said, the betrayal sitting in my stomach like a stone. I told him some things, and he must have told either Sienna or our father. The confirmation came 2 days later when Garrett called me. His voice was cold, nothing like the warm brother I'd talked to over coffee. Harper, I think you need to stop whatever you're doing, he said without preamble. Sienna helped me understand that your sudden interest in the company, all your questions, it's not innocent curiosity. You're trying to undermine Dad and me. You're trying to take something that isn't yours. I felt sick. Garrett, that's not what's happening. I just wanted to understand how the business works. He cut me off. Don't lie to me. I know you've been researching shareholder structures, asking questions about voting rights. Sienna showed me how all the pieces fit together. You're jealous because I'm going to inherit the company, and you can't stand it. Sienna, of course. She'd taken the fragments of information Garrett had innocently shared with her and spun them into a narrative of betrayal and ambition. And my brother, who I'd opened my heart to, had chosen to believe her over me. So what are you going to do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I already did it, he said. I told Dad everything. Hez hiring forensic accountants to trace your finances. Hez going to find out what you're hiding, Harper. And when he does, you'll be cut off completely. No more family, no more name, nothing. You brought this on yourself. The phone went dead in my hand, and I sat there in my apartment feeling like my chest was being crushed. My brother, the last person I'd thought might care about me, had betrayed me to protect his inheritance and his place in our father's empire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the years I'd spent accumulating shares, building power, working toward this moment. My father now knew something was wrong, and his forensic accountants were good. They might not find everything. Maxwell had been too clever for that, but they'd find enough to make him vigilant, to make him shore up his defenses. And Garrett, my own brother, had been the one to light the fuse on this bomb. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I'd lost weight from stress. My eyes had dark circles under them, and I looked 10 years older than my actual age. For just a moment, I thought about giving up, about walking away from all of this and starting a new life somewhere far from the Sinclair name and all its poison. But then I thought about little 8-year-old Harper, holding her trophy and waiting for her father to care. I thought about every dismissal, every insult, every time it'd been made to feel worthless. And I decided that I'd come too far to quit now. 3 weeks after Garrett's betrayal, my father summoned me to the family mansion. I knew this wasn't going to be pleasant, but I went anyway because I needed to know exactly what had found out and how much danger I was in. He was waiting for me in his study, the same room where Head rejected my dreams 1,000 times before. This time, Vivian was there too, sitting in the chair that used to be my mother's, looking like a cat who'd caught a particularly satisfying mouse. My father didn't waste time with pleasantries. I'm cutting you off financially, effective immediately, he said, his voice like ice. I won't be giving you another penny, not for birthdays, not for holidays, nothing. You're 30 years old, you should have been self-sufficient long ago anyway. Furthermore, I've had my lawyers update my will. You're no longer listed as a beneficiary. Everything. The company, the properties, the investments, all of it goes to Garrett. You'll get nothing when I die. Each word landed like a physical blow, but I kept my face carefully neutral. I'd been preparing for this possibility for years, but hearing it actually happen still hurt more than I'd expected. Vivian couldn't resist twisting the knife a little deeper. Richard, should we tell her about the other thing? She said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. My father nodded, and Vivian continued. We've been talking to people in our social circle, Harper. We've let them know that you've been having some financial difficulties, making some questionable decisions. Several of our friends have daughters around your age, and we've advised them to be cautious about associating with you. Wed hate for your problems to become their problems. It took me a moment to understand what she was saying. They were actively destroying my reputation in San Francisco society, spreading rumors that I was unstable, financially reckless, not to be trusted. It was a sophisticated form of social assassination, and it would make it harder for me to network, to advance my career, to exist in the world they controlled. You've done all this because you think I'm trying to take something from you, I said quietly. But you've never even asked me what I actually want. My father stood up, signaling the meeting was over. What you want doesn't matter, Harper. What matters is protecting this family and this company from anyone who would threaten it, including you. Now get out of my house. Over the next few weeks, the rumors did their damage. I started noticing that invitations to industry events dried up. Colleagues who used to be friendly became distant. One of my closest work friends finally pulled me aside and told me that she'd heard I was being investigated for financial fraud, that I'd stolen from my family, that I was unstable and possibly dangerous. None of it was true, but the lies had spread so far that the truth didn't matter anymore. I came home to my apartment one evening and just collapsed. I sat on my floor with my back against the wall and cried, harder than I'd cried since my mother died. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, felt like it was crumbling around me. My reputation was in ruins. My family had disowned me. And even though I'd accumulated 29% of Sinclair Tech's shares, I was beginning to wonder if it had all been for nothing. What was the point of having power if wielding it would destroy what was left of my life? I called Maxwell that night, my voice hoarse from crying. I can't do this anymore, I told him. Maybe I should just sell the shares back, take whatever profit I can get, and move somewhere far away. Start over where nobody knows the Sinclair name. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Maxwell said something I'll never forget. Harper, I've known a lot of people in my career. Most of them were smart, some were even brilliant, but very few of them had what you have, which is the strength to keep going when everything is stacked against them. Your father took everything from you, your childhood, your family, your dignity. Are you really going to let him take your future too? You're so close, Harper. Just 2% more and you'll have 31%. That's real power, power he can't take away from you. Don't give up now. I sat there listening to him, and slowly, very slowly, I felt something shift inside me. He was right. I'd spent 30 years being Harper Sinclair, the useless daughter. But I'd also spent 8 years being something else, a strategist, an investor, a woman who'd built an empire in secret right under her father's nose. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid of what I might lose and start thinking about what I was going to win. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror again, but this time I saw someone different. I saw a woman who'd survived everything her family had thrown at her and come out stronger. I saw a fighter who wasn't finished fighting. I called Maxwell back. Let's accelerate the timeline, I said. I want to acquire the last 2% we need as quickly as possible. I don't care what it costs. And I want to be ready to reveal everything at the right moment. A moment where it will have maximum impact. Maxwell's voice warmed with approval. I think I know the perfect opportunity, he said. Your father just sent out invitations to a 30th anniversary celebration for Sinclair Tech. It's going to be at his Malibu estate, 300 guests, full media coverage. Has planning to announce Garrett as the new COO that night, position him as the successor. What better moment to remind everyone that Richard Sinclair doesn't control everything? I smiled for the first time in weeks. Let's do it, I said. Let's show them exactly who I am. The next 6 months were the most intense of my life. Maxwell and I worked around the clock to acquire the final shares I needed to reach 31%. It wasn't easy. Some of the remaining shareholders were holding out for higher prices, others were suspicious of our offers, and a few were simply difficult to locate after years of being passive investors. But one by one, we brought them in. Maxwell's network proved invaluable. He knew people who knew people, and he could navigate the complex web of corporate relationships like a master. We offered fair prices, sometimes even generous prices, because this wasn't about saving money, this was about securing power. By March, 8 months before my father's planned celebration, ID reached 29.5%. By June, ID hit 30.3%. And by September, exactly 1 month before the party, I owned precisely 31.02% of Sinclair Tech. The shares were distributed across 7 different shell companies, all legitimate, all properly registered, all completely legal. Maxwell had created a corporate structure so complex that it would take weeks of investigation to trace it all back to me. But once someone did, every single document would be in perfect order. Maxwell explained the significance of what ID accomplished. Your father owns 42%, which sounds like a controlling stake, but it's not absolute control. Garrett has 15%, which he'll presumably vote in line with your father. That gives them 57% combined. But here's where it gets interesting. The company bylaws require a 2/3 majority, that's 67%, for certain major decisions. Selling the company, taking it private, fundamentally altering the business model. With your 31%, you can block any of those moves. You have veto power. Plus, as a major shareholder, you're entitled to a seat on the board of directors. They can't legally exclude you anymore. I sat there absorbing this information, feeling the weight of what ID built. I wasn't just Richard Sinclair's useless daughter anymore. I was a major power in his company, and there was nothing he could do about it. The invitation to my father's party arrived in late September, delivered by courier to my apartment. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, everything about it screaming wealth and power. Richard Sinclair cordially invites you to celebrate 30 years of innovation and excellence at Sinclair Technologies. Join us for an evening of recognition, reflection, and revelations about the future. Saturday, October 24th, 7 p.m., Sinclair Estate, Malibu. The word revelations jumped out at me. He was planning something big, almost certainly the announcement about Garrett. This would be his moment of triumph, celebrating his legacy and anointing his heir in front of everyone who mattered in the California tech scene. And I was going to turn it into something very different. Maxwell and I met 3 times a week to plan every detail of my revelation. We prepared all the legal documentation, having 3 different law firms independently verify my ownership to prevent any claims that the documents were fraudulent. We crafted talking points, anticipating every possible question or challenge. We even did mock presentations, with Maxwell playing the role of hostile questioners so I could practice staying calm under pressure. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed watching the hours tick by on my clock, my mind racing through everything that could go wrong. What if my father had somehow found out and had a countermove prepared? What if the media ignored the story and it just became a family embarrassment with no real consequences? What if I went through with this and it destroyed the last tiny chance that my family might someday accept me? But every time I started to doubt, I remembered 8-year-old Harper with her trophy, 14-year-old Harper being ignored by her brother, 21-year-old Harper being rejected from the family company, 30-year-old Harper being cut out of the will and slandered to society. I remembered every hurt, every dismissal, every moment when I was made to feel worthless. And I knew that I couldn't back down now, not after coming this far. At 6 a.m., I got up and started getting ready. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple black dress, elegant but not showy, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I owned that mattered. I wanted to look professional, powerful, but not like I was trying too hard. I wanted them to underestimate me right up until the moment I proved them wrong. At 5 p.m., I got into my car, a modest Honda that I'd bought with my own money, and began the drive to Malibu. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The manila folder on my passenger seat contained copies of all my ownership documents, prepared for distribution to the media. This was it, the moment 8 years of work had been building toward. In 2 hours, I would either achieve the vindication I'd been working for, or I would spectacularly destroy everything. There was no going back now. The Sinclair estate in Malibu was lit up like a palace, with hundreds of tiny lights strung through the palm trees and a massive white tent set up on the back lawn overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Valets in crisp uniforms were parking Ferraris, Bentleys, and Teslas. I pulled up in my Honda and watched the valet's expression flicker with barely concealed contempt before he schooled his features into professional neutrality. I walked up the stone pathway to the main entrance, my heels clicking against the pavers, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Inside, the party was already in full swing. 300 of California's wealthiest and most influential people milled around with champagne flutes, their laughter and conversation creating a buzzing hum that made my head spin. I saw tech CEOs I recognized from magazine covers, venture capitalists who controlled billions in assets, politicians, celebrities, and members of the old money families that still held sway in San Francisco society. Everyone was dressed in designer clothes that cost more than I made in a month. Everyone belonged in this world except me. I spotted Vivian almost immediately, resplendent in a silver gown that probably cost $50,000, holding court with a group of women who were hanging on her every word. Sienna was nearby in crimson silk, her arm linked through Garrett's, both of them looking like the perfect power couple. My brother saw me and his expression hardened. He leaned over to whisper something to Sienna, and she looked at me with undisguised hostility. Neither of them came over to greet me, which was fine. I didn't want their false pleasantries. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, more to have something to hold than because I wanted to drink it, and positioned myself near the back of the crowd where I could see the stage that had been set up at one end of the tent. At exactly 8 p.m., the lights dimmed and a spotlight illuminated the stage. My father walked out to thunderous applause, looking every inch the titan of industry in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his silver hair perfect, his smile confident and commanding. He gave a speech about the founding of Sinclair Tech 30 years ago, about the vision and sacrifice it had taken to build it into a multi-billion-dollar company, about innovation and legacy in the future. He was a gifted speaker. I had to give him that. He knew how to work a room, when to pause for laughter, when to let emotion creep into his voice. And then he got to the part I'd been waiting for. But tonight isn't just about looking back, he said, his voice swelling with pride. It's about looking forward to the next generation of leadership. I'm thrilled to announce that my son, Garrett Sinclair, will be taking on the role of Chief Operating Officer of Sinclair Technologies, effective immediately. The crowd erupted in applause. Garrett walked onto the stage, shaking hands with our father, both of them beaming. I'm blessed, my father continued, to have a son who is brilliant, dedicated, and worthy of carrying on my legacy. And then he turned, pointing directly at me in the crowd. I felt every eye in the room swivel to follow his gesture, unlike my useless daughter over there, who's never contributed anything to this family. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that tent. I felt 300 pairs of eyes boring into me, saw some people smirking, others looking uncomfortable, a few whispering behind their hands. Vivian and Sienna were barely containing their triumphant smiles. This was supposed to be my humiliation, the final proof that I didn't matter, that I never would, but they had no idea what was coming. I set down my champagne glass and started walking toward the stage. My legs felt like jelly, but I kept them moving, one step after another, my head held high. I could hear confused murmuring as I climbed the steps to the stage. My father's expression shifted from surprise to anger. "Harper, what are you doing? This isn't the time." I walked right up to him and took the microphone from his hand. He was too shocked to resist. I turned to face the crowd, all those powerful people staring at me with curiosity and confusion, and I took a deep breath. "Good evening, everyone," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "My name is Harper Sinclair. I'm Richard's daughter, as you just heard. And he's right about one thing. I haven't contributed much to this family, but that's because they never wanted my contributions." I paused, reaching into my small clutch purse and pulling out a folded document. "However, I have been contributing to Sinclair Technologies in ways my father never knew about. You see, over the past 8 years, I've been carefully acquiring shares of this company. Shares from early investors, from former employees, from offshore holdings, all purchased legally, all properly documented, all verified by multiple independent law firms. I unfolded the document and held it up. Ladies and gentlemen, I currently own exactly 31% of Sinclair Technologies. I am the second largest shareholder of this company. The silence broke. People gasped, started talking over each other, pulling out phones to fact-check what I'd just said. I saw my father's face turn bright red, saw Garrett's jaw literally drop open. Vivian looked like she'd been slapped, and Sienna's perfect composure shattered into obvious panic. "That's impossible," my father sputtered into the microphone I was still holding. "You don't have that kind of money." I turned to face him. "Actually, I do. Grandmother left me $500,000. Remember? You were annoyed about it. I invested it wisely, grew it into millions, and used those millions to buy your company out from under you, one share at a time. While you were telling everyone how useless I was building real power." I addressed the crowd again. "Here are the legal documents, verified by Morrison and Associates, Talbot Legal Group, and Chen Partnership. Every purchase was legitimate. Every share is mine." I gestured to Maxwell, who I'd spotted standing near the back of the tent. He nodded and started distributing packets to the journalists I knew were in attendance. My father tried to grab the microphone back. "Harper, we need to discuss this privately." I stepped away from him, keeping the mic. "No, we discuss it here, now, in front of everyone. Because I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being dismissed. I'm tired of hiding." Vivian rushed up to the stage, her face a mask of false concern. "Harper, sweetheart, you're making a scene. This is inappropriate." I turned to her with a smile that had no warmth in it. "Oh, is framing me for theft inappropriate, Vivian? Is spreading lies about me throughout San Francisco society inappropriate? Because I have evidence of all of that, and I've been saving it for the right moment. Don't push me." She actually took a step back, her face going pale. Garrett was still frozen in place, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. I turned back to the audience. "As a 31% shareholder, I'm entitled to certain rights under California corporate law and under Sinclair Tech's bylaws. I'm entitled to a seat on the board of directors. I'm entitled to financial disclosure. And I have veto power over major corporate decisions that require a 2/3 majority. My father owns 42%. That sounds like a lot, but it's not absolute control. Not anymore." I could see people in the crowd nodding, some of them clearly impressed despite themselves. Several of the tech journalists were frantically typing on their phones. My father had recovered enough to try a different tactic. He turned to the crowd, attempting to position himself as the victim. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a family matter that's gotten out of hand. My daughter is upset, understandably, about some past disagreements. But buying shares behind your own father's back, that's not business, that's betrayal." I cut him off. "Betrayal? Like how you betrayed Dr. Edmund Whitman, your old mentor and partner. The man who helped you develop the core technology that this entire company is built on? The man you pushed out and denied proper compensation?" I saw several older guests react to that name, recognition and discomfort crossing their faces. My father's eyes widened. "I'd hit a nerve. Everything I did was legal, Dad. Can you say the same about how you built your empire?" The tent erupted in noise. People were shouting questions, cameras were flashing, journalists were pushing forward. My father stood there looking older than I'd ever seen him. His moment of triumph turned into a public relations nightmare. I held up my hand for quiet, and surprisingly, the crowd settled down. "I'm not here to destroy this company," I said. "I'm actually here to make it better. Effective immediately, I'll be exercising my rights as a major shareholder. I'm demanding full transparency in financial reporting. I'm proposing new bylaws that protect minority shareholders and prevent the kind of consolidation of power that allows one person to act like a king. And am going to work to make sure that talent and merit, not gender or family connection, determine who leads this company into the future." I looked at Garrett, who was still standing there looking stunned. "I have nothing against you, Garrett. You might make a great COO, but you should have earned it, not inherited it. And from now on, every major decision this company makes will will have to account for my voice, whether you like it or not." I handed the microphone back to my father, who took it mechanically, and I walked off the stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Maxwell met me at the edge of the tent with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. "That was perfect," he whispered. "Every major tech outlet is going to run this story. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Silicon Valley will know your name." I nodded, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted, like I'd just run a marathon. As I walked toward the exit, several people stopped me. A few were hostile, friends of my father who clearly viewed me as a traitor, but more were impressed, successful people who appreciated the strategy and patience it had taken to pull this off. One woman, a venture capitalist I'd admired from afar for years, shook my hand and said, "That took serious guts. If you ever want to get coffee and talk about investment strategy, call me." I left the party at 9:30 p.m., climbing into my modest Honda while valets scrambled around exotic cars worth more than houses. As I drove away from the glittering estate, I caught a glimpse of it in my rearview mirror, all those lights and all those people, and I realized something profound. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need my father's love or my brother's respect or a place at their table. I had my own power now. Power I'd earned through intelligence, patience, and refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. The next few weeks were chaos. The story exploded across tech news sites and business publications. Silicon Valley daughter stages quiet takeover of father's company. Read one headline. Harper Sinclair, the shareholder your CEO father never saw coming. Read another. I gave exactly 3 interviews. Carefully controlled conversations where I emphasized the legal and ethical aspects of what I'd done while avoiding personal attacks on my family. Within a month, I was formally seated on Sinclair Tech's board of directors. My father had no choice but to accept it. The law and public opinion were on my side. Garrett, surprisingly, reached out to me about 6 weeks after the party. We met for coffee, just like we had 2 years earlier, but this time the dynamic was completely different. "I underestimated you," he said simply. "Sienna told me you were trying to destroy the family, and I believed her because it was easier than believing my own sister could be that brilliant and that patient. I'm sorry." It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a start. Vivian and my father's relationship deteriorated rapidly after the party. Turned out that when he was no longer the unchallenged king of his domain, she lost interest in playing queen. They separated within 6 months, and Vivian walked away with a hefty settlement but none of the long-term control she'd been angling for. As for me, I moved into a new apartment in Palo Alto, something I could actually afford now that my shares were paying dividends. I started using my position on the board to push for changes, more diverse hiring practices, better protection for whistleblowers, transparency in executive compensation. Some of my proposals passed, some didn't, but my voice was heard. That was what mattered. On my 33rd birthday, I sat alone in my apartment with a glass of wine, looking out at the city lights, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. It had taken 32 years to prove my worth to a man who would never fully see it, but in the process, I'd proven it to myself. I'd learned that you don't need other people's validation to be valuable. You don't need your family's love to be worthy of love. You just need the courage to believe in yourself, even when no one else does, and the strength to keep fighting for what you deserve. Sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the greatest gift of all, motivation. My father called me a useless daughter in front of 300 people, and he meant it as an insult, as a final humiliation. Instead, it became the moment I stepped out of the shadows and claimed the power I'd been building for 8 years. Now, every time he walks into a board meeting, he sees me sitting at that table. Every time he makes a major decision, he knows I have the power to question it, to challenge it, to stop it if it's wrong. Every time he looks at the company he built, he sees my name right next to his on the shareholder documents. That's not revenge, that's justice. That's what happens when you dismiss someone's potential. Sometimes they spend years quietly proving you wrong, and then they prove it so loudly that you can never unhear it. I'm Harper Sinclair. I own 31% of my father's company, and am just getting started. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have believed in you? Maybe it was a parent, a teacher, a boss, or a partner who told you that you weren't good enough, smart enough, or capable enough. What did you do about it? Did you prove them wrong? Or are you still working on it? I want to hear your stories in the comments below because I know I'm not the only one who's fought this battle. Drop a comment and let me know where you're at in your journey. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen or inspired or just entertained for the last half hour, please hit that like button. It really does help more people find these stories. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because I've got so many more stories like this one. Stories about people who refuse to accept the limitations others tried to put on them. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's struggling with their own family drama or fighting to prove their worth in a world that keeps dismissing them. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community. Remember, your worth isn't determined by the people who can't see it. It's determined by what you build when no one's watching. Keep fighting, keep building, and keep proving them wrong. I'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves out there, and never, ever let anyone convince you that you're useless. You're not. You're just getting started.